Hi, welcome back to the Weekly Why. This week we have, I think, one of the central parshas of the entire Torah. We have Parsha Yitro. This week we have I would say, the culmination, the pinnacle of the Jewish exodus from Egypt, where we have the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, where the entire nation of Israel stood as a people, as an entire nation, and received the Torah. And so, obviously, there are a million and one things that can be said about this, but one thing in particular I want to address. And this is the theatrics of the event itself. And the way that, here we're in the book of Exodus right now, the way that the Torah here describes this time, you imagine, just close your eyes, you imagine the entire people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, and just millions of people around you, or however many people there are. And then you have this momentous occasion, and listen to the way that the Torah describes this. This is in Exodus chapter 19. It says, "It came to pass on the third day, when it was morning, and there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud was upon the mountain, and a very powerful blast of the shofar, and the entire nation was in the camp shuddered. And the entire Mount Sinai smoked, because God had descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the fire of the kiln." So you see here, this describes like just a complete theatrical event with fire and sound and lightning. Is just quite an incredible event. And so the first question, I think, is why exactly was this needed? If this is needed to impress the Jewish people and convince them that God existed, that doesn't really work, because remember the 10 plagues of Egypt we just read about in the last few weeks. So clearly that can't work. I mean, the Jewish people had seen their fair share of fancy theatrical work and light shows, so this wasn't new to them. So what was so unique about this? There are a number of different answers, and I think the second one is the most powerful. The first one, there are many, but the first one, Rabbi Eli Monk, what he says is that really this is a way to identify that God is the master of all. So what that means is, for example, God could theoretically have communicated to every single person individually, like a whisper in the ear. However, it lacks a certain dramatic impact that an event like this would have. And so what that means is that thousands of years in the future, whenever a future claimant said, "Oh, look, I'm God," or "You should follow a new God," the Jewish people would be able to compare those claims to this momentous occasion. So in other words, everything else would pale in comparison to this. And so that the Jewish people would be able to fairly easily identify, really, and compare it to this particular formative event. So in other words, if in future somebody claimed to be God or to follow another God, they would be able simply to look back and say, well, was it really anything compared to this? And if not, certainly that would make short work of that claim. But there's a second claim, and this was made by Rabbi Levovitz, and he was in the 19th century, I believe. One of the things he said was that this wasn't really such a great miracle. I mean, yes, it was a sound and light show, but really this was very much an integral part. Really, it's a natural state of affairs. The Torah is called Eish Das. It's like a fiery law. So in other words, can you imagine that in the Midrash, like the Jewish homilies are filled with stories about rabbis when they would study Torah, birds overhead would burn. So, I mean, very, obviously a little bit fanciful, but really the idea here is that there's such a powerful, real spiritual force to the Torah itself, in that this wasn't a specific miracle in itself, but just the natural state of the Torah coming to earth. So, if the Torah is Eish Das, a fiery law, the Torah being given to humanity would create such a fire and light and sound show that this isn't really an unusual or unexpected miracle at all. Rather, it's very much expected and integral with the Torah being given to humanity. And so the lesson for us, certainly, is that obviously we're not living in that kind of an environment, and who's to know really, when they talk about the rabbis learning and the birds overhead being singed, quite how literal that is. But the idea, I think, is pretty clear, is that learning Torah, and that the transmission of Torah from heavens to the earth, which is ultimately what we're doing when we're studying Torah, is supposed to have that similar impact. So what that means is that when we're studying Torah, when we're learning Torah, and most importantly, perhaps most importantly, when we're teaching over that Torah we've learned, it's not supposed to just be dry intellectual facts that we learn from an encyclopedia or anywhere else. It's really supposed to create that kind of a spiritual reality, as opposed to create fire and lights and things like that. So ultimately, the take-home lesson for us is to look back and say, if Mount Sinai, this formative event in Jewish and world history, when the entire Jewish nation stood and received the Torah on Mount Sinai, if that created this kind of a natural impact, just the Torah coming from the heavens into the earth, then we should all strive to at least achieve just a tiny percent of that when we ourselves study and bring down that Torah in the heavens into the earth, and then when we give that forward to others as well. So that's Parsha Yitro for the Weekly Why. Best wishes, Shabbat Shalom, and God bless.